We've really enjoyed over the years working with Partners Environmental. They have worked with a number of our land banks around the state, and there have been really good relationships. As you know, we talked about it in the last panel. We talked about solar power and the issues of contaminated land or landfill sites and sites that appear to be unusable came up. We talked about that to John and to John Zampino and John Garvey in the context of potential using for solar fields. But I think there's many other problems we deal with on sites that are smaller and aren't going to be reused for solar or any other possible uses without cleaning up the land first. So without any further delay, I want to thank you for this panel and good luck. And if you have problems with the advancing the slides, just tell them next slide.
Okay.
You ready? Go.
Yeah, I'm trying to close that. Okay. Are we going?
No, we see you. We just don't see any PowerPoint. There you go.
Okay. So good afternoon or good morning. My name is John Zampino. I'm here with John Garvey with Partners Environmental. We are both certified professionals with the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency and are going to speak today very briefly about our role working with land banks and developers and municipalities on how to address environmental impacts on properties to get them back on the tax roll and being reused. Next slide, please. As you can see by this slide, there's many land banks out there, and what we have been encountering is that the dilemma for land banks is that there is less funding, but the need for redevelopment is not slowing down. Initially, there was a lot of federal money out there for the demolition of underutilized or vacant structures due to the subprime lending debacle and the recession. Land banks played a key role with removing those structures. And now with that money drying up, we're still left with brownfields to deal with. What we've noticed in the past year or so is that the creativity that is out there amongst land banks, consultants, developers, and municipalities has to increase in order to develop a team that can approach and attack brownfield properties together. Next slide, please. So the dilemma for brownfields, as I've mentioned, John and I are certified professionals with the Ohio EPA. We've done hundreds of tank pulls and asbestos abatements, and I think between the two of us, we have almost 40 covenants not to sue with the program. While that's not always an applicable program for brownfields, we do have a lot of experience in migrating through these projects and finding unique solutions that work for all parties. Next slide, please. So the current definition of a brownfield is that the US EPA defines a brownfield as a property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. Now, what's interesting about this definition is that the original definition had a term the term underutilized in it. And that posed difficulty because of the fact that it really wasn't defined how do you determine what is underutilized. So, and it was hard to demonstrate that. So to broaden the definition, that was removed, the word underutilized was removed, and instead the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse was placed in that spot. Now the importance of that is, what that does is it broadens the numbers, types of properties that can be used for various redevelopment. So an example would be that a municipality or developer is interested in doing a 2 or 3 acre redevelopment of a very popular corner in any town. And there's a dry cleaner that's active, or a gas station that is active within that acreage of the redevelopment. Well, now that the definition is expanded, that property does not have to be underutilized, which was difficult to determine. It can just pose an issue to expansion, redevelopment, or reuse, and therefore makes it more eligible for a land bank to come in and work through the process of removing that hurdle. Next slide, please. I may have alluded this to earlier on the prior slide, but the main issue with the brownfield is that there's no responsible party, but significant liability to an owner or a new owner. And the brownfield may not just be big industrial sites. There's numerous properties that are your quarter acre machine shop or plating facility that are in very high value locations that are still considered brownfields and have contamination that needs to be addressed. Next slide, please. So what happens to a brownfield? In Ohio, we had a developer who made a statement that was very interesting. If you could get the land for free and it's clean, the deal still may not work. So what that means is that this developer that we were working with does work in Ohio, and he had a property in California, in West Hollywood. The property was a 0.7 acre site with a $200,000 underground storage tank cleanup, and the property was worth $20 million at the end of it, just as a purchase price. Well, in California, that $200,000 does not pose an extreme hurdle because of the payback on the backside of his redevelopment. The development went forward, they did the cleanup, and the developer is making money off of that property. Now, however, in Ohio, you may have the same 0.7 acre parcel with a $200,000 underground storage tank cleanup, but the actual value of the property will not allow, not allow is not a good word, prohibits or makes it more difficult for the deal to go through. So your return on investment, if you have a return on investment, is slim to almost none if the property is only worth $180,000 based on tax assessment or the current rate of value of the property. So the traditional result is that the property will sit abandoned and underutilized. Government entity may pursue public subsidy to acquire and redevelop the property, or the developer may acquire it, but that's very rare. Next slide, please. Okay, so the dilemma that we're faced with is that funding is often available, and there's always an end user, not always, but there is typically an end user looking for property, and they're both available for brownfield redevelopment. But the project cannot proceed without an entity to own the site while environmental issues are investigated and or remediated. due to concerns such as environmental cleanup costs and potential overruns, regulatory risk, corporate or government policies, and the risk tolerance of the players on a particular deal. Next slide, please. So next we're going to just quickly go through how the land banks can fill the void when we have that dilemma. Next slide. So what we have, the following, this slide actually deals with the safe harbor provisions that accompany land banks. Well, this is more of a legal slide. We're going to be providing just a summary of this information and don't want to be held to any legal interpretation on it. So the safe harbor provisions. Due to the foreclosure process, the land bank would not be considered a responsible party under CERCLA. That is assuming that the environmental due diligence, preferably a phase 1 site assessment to earn the bona fide prospective purchaser defense, is completed. The second is under ORC 575722, there's an immunity of land reutilization corporations, and they're not liable for violations of Chapter 3745, which is the Ohio EPA regulations, and 6111, which is the BUSTER, the Bureau of Underground Storage Tank Regulations, in connection with a parcel of land acquired by the Land Reutilization Corporation. Now, in addition, under ORC 5723.014, the land bank may enter a forfeited land or any of the buildings for any one of the following reasons: to inspect it, to conduct a voluntary action, which is referring to Ohio's voluntary action program, or conduct a health and safety inspection. What's important about the ability to do that is that the land banks can actually gain information with partners such as environmental consultants, city, developers. They can gain information that can be turned around and provided to the public that allows for planning and a brief summary of items that may be prohibiting the redevelopment of a particular parcel. The land bank, unless there's willful misconduct, the land bank will not be liable for any testing or release of hazardous materials. What that refers to is that as an environmental consultant, we're asked to enter into a property, do soil and groundwater sampling, and unless we were willful in our conduct, not oftentimes, there may be the chance to exacerbate an existing condition. For instance, hitting an underground storage tank, making a penetration in it, and it would leak. As many of these properties, there's very limited information, and therefore, in order for us to gain this information, we have to have some form of protections and working through the land bank that allows us to do our work safely. Next slide, please. So at this point, we have realized that we have properties that have environmental impacts that meet the definition of the US EPA's Brownfield. We know that there's the land bank, developers, and municipalities that want to address these sites. And how do we identify funding for these locations? Next slide, please. So this table, which is available on the US EPA and the Ohio EPA's website, identifies and actually outlines the entities that will provide funding and minimum requirements for projects, as well as the available information, available dollars, and so on. And I was going to take a few minutes just to walk through this, as it's very helpful as a planning tool based on the players of or your team that are approaching to do a deal with a brownfield property. Across the top, the funding programs are provided by the Ohio EPA, Jobs Ohio Revitalization Fund, the Ohio Brownfield Fund, the Abandoned Gas Station Cleanup Program, and the US EPA. Currently, the Ohio EPA has a program called the Targeted Brownfield Assessment, by which you can approach the Ohio EPA requesting dollars for brownfields, and as you go down the left-hand side, you'll see eligible activities. You can have the TBA pay for phase 1s, limited phase 2s, asbestos surveys, and geophysical surveys, as an example. This project is project specific. This source is project specific. It offers dollars on a rolling cycle. An item of interest would be that there's no end use required. The prerequisite documents, also a category on the left-hand side of this, is dependent on the scope of services. So meaning you can come in with a project that essentially has no information and you would be eligible. And then it outlines at the very bottom what the deliverable would be. It would be an assessment report, a phase 1 report that meets ASTM, AAI, and the VAP, and then sampling results. The next funding program would be the Jobs Ohio Revitalization Fund. They will provide funding for assessment and cleanup. The eligible applicants are local governments, nonprofits, and for-profits. All brownfields are eligible. The dollar amounts are outlined that you may earn up to acquire $200,000 for assessment, and cleanup can be as much as $5 million in a loan or $1 million in a gap grant. This is no match is required for the assessment work, but there is the cleanup portion of it is reimbursable up to 75% of eligible costs. However, with the Jobs Ohio projects, the potential purchaser, user, or the group working through this do need a phase 1 completed with a scope of work that estimates the phase 2 assessment costs. Similarly, with the cleanup, you would have had to have completed your phase 1 and phase 2 assessments and then had a cleanup cost estimate. This program, this is where a lot of times the TBA can be used in conjunction with Jobs Ohio to perform a phase 1 and develop the scope of work for the phase 2, and then proceed with your Jobs Ohio funding. As far as my experience has been, there's been no one's precluded from using one or more of these programs on a project. The Ohio Brownfield Fund is a loan program. It's eligible for all brownfields. You can get a $500,000 loan for phase 2s and $5 million for cleanups. These are low interest loans. There's no match required. You must deliver a VAP compliant phase 2 report with a no further action letter. So that would require the use of a certified professional licensed under Ohio's Voluntary Action Program. Our next funding program is the Ohio's Abandoned Gas Station Cleanup Program. These are related to former they're only eligible for gas stations that are owned by a municipality or the land bank, have no responsible party, and are identified by the Bureau of Underground Storage Tanks as a Class C site. So the criteria for the abandoned gas station program is a little bit more specific and set in stone before you can become eligible for the available funding. Monies include $100,000 for assessment and $500,000 for cleanup. Our final deliverable would be a Buster or VAP compliant assessment report or no further action letter. Lastly, we have the US EPA funding programs. These are for assessment and cleanup. They're administered by the US EPA, and these are provided annually on a competitive basis. Local governments, quasi-government entities, nonprofits, and states and tribes can apply or prepare an application, for assessment or cleanup dollars. However, as they mentioned, it's a competitive program. So, and you are competing with other applicants within your region. So, or throughout the nation, yes. Sorry about that. These programs allow you to get assessment dollars on a community-wide basis, a site-specific property, or under a coalition. Now, a coalition would be a municipality or multiple municipalities, a municipality and a nonprofit, and they would go in together and prepare the application for specific locations. Monies available are $300,000 for the community wide, $200,000 per site on a site-specific basis, and $600,000 for a coalition. These dollars can be split into hazardous materials and petroleum, and there'll be particular uses for each of those. And your final, we don't have any, you don't need any prerequisite documents except your application. Under the cleanup program, the only variable that you can get $500,000 per site, you will need a 20% cost share as far as the cleanup dollars are concerned. Under both programs, there's no end user needed. So as I had mentioned earlier, when we brought this slide up, this table can help you identify potential sources based on your property or the unique specifics of your property and the team that you're working with on a brownfield project. And again, it's important to know that there's no preclusion for using multiple sources of these funds on a particular project. It's been mine and John's experience where we've tapped into various programs on a certain project, and you stack the dollars and use them accordingly to move through your environmental issues. Next slide, please. So what we're going to do now is walk through a series of examples that touch on many of the different applications of projects that the land bank and other stakeholders have been involved in. And I'm going to turn the computer over to John right now, Garvey, and we'll go from there.
All right. Thanks, John. So like Jen said, we'll go through a few case studies and discuss, what the brownfield was and where the dollars came from to deal with some of these blighted sites. The first example is, next slide, please. Was in Richmond Heights, abandoned gas station. The owner had passed, was working through the buster process and passed away, and it became an eyesore for the city of Richmond Heights. And so they started reaching out. They had no funds to deal with it. And they had started reaching out to find some public funding for it. And that's where we were first approached. Next slide. So the owner had spent a couple $100,000 working through this, program, working through the buster program, and then passed away. Had essentially gone bankrupt working through the program, and there was just nothing left to deal with the underground storage tanks that remained at the property. And again, it just became rundown, and after about 10 years, they finally approached the county, who had site assessment dollars from the US EPA. So Cuyahoga County had a community-wide site assessment grant from US EPA, and they hired us under that grant to take a first look at the gas station and begin to start seeking a Class C determination. Next slide. Once we got involved and we determined that there was contamination there that was going to require cleanup, there was a dilemma. The tanks were still in the ground, and no one was willing to take ownership of the property in order to get the tanks out. And so, working with Cuyahoga County and their demolition funds, and Cuyahoga Land Bank and their demolition funds, and their ability to take ownership and get the cleanup done, demolition funds were used to remove the tanks from the ground under some of those authorities that John talked about earlier. And once the tanks were out of the ground, the land bank was able to take ownership safely. It was debated whether they could take ownership safely with the tanks in the ground, but Cuyahoga Land Bank was not interested in testing that at the time. So we did find a way to get the tanks out using demolition money. They took ownership, and then the land bank entered into an agreement with the city and Cuyahoga County to administer the funds to go through the cleanup. And that was a revolving loan fund, US EPA revolving loan fund that was provided by Cuyahoga County that was used for proceeding. Next slide. It was because we got a Class C determination, we were able to move through John, we have to do polling questions.
Okay.
We were able to enter the voluntary action program instead of going through the buster process, which we believed would be more efficient. And ultimately, we were able to get issue the NFA on the property, and that site is now a fenced green space, not put back into use, but no longer a blight to the city. And so that was a combination of US EPA dollars from Cuyahoga County, demolition funds from the land bank, and assessment funds from both the land bank and the county. And both of their money came from US EPA on the assessment end. So we can go through the next slide and then on to the next example. And John, what do we need to do for our polling questions? How does that work?
I think we just asked. I'm not sure.
All right. Well,
I
ours
think-
was submitted, correct?
John, I think Rock the House has to post those. Rock the House, are you there?
Okay, I just need to ask them to pull it up. Okay. Polling question 1. All right, we'll close ours, right, John?
Yeah.
Because we're obviously here. Okay. This is next example is obviously a far less common, I guess, in terms of brownfields. It's the old Parmadale Hospital. And this was basically a former orphanage in the city of Parma. West Creek Conservancy was interested in acquiring it and expanding the park. And they ended up seeking help from the Cuyahoga Land Bank. Cuyahoga Land Bank had a US EPA community-wide assessment grant at the time, and they still do, and I think have since then. But so this originally was an institutional. It was essentially orphanage with school and church. West Creek Reservation got $1.5 million in Clean Ohio conservation funds to acquire the land, and needed to go through the assessment process. And what we found out there was using the US EPA dollars from the land bank, was they had a significant asbestos concern that would have to be addressed prior to demolition. But we did the phase 1 and the phase 2, some underground storage tank work, and all of the environmental issues except asbestos were quite manageable. West Creek is entered into partnership or an agreement with Cleveland Metro Parks, who will be the stewards of the property for the long term. And if you go to the next slide, this is just a picture of the path that leads to the Parmadale area and will be connected and go through the Parmadale area once the abatement is complete. Unfortunately, last I knew, the abatement was not complete, and vandalism and arson was a fairly significant issue at the site. So hopefully that abatement can occur quickly and soon. This is next example is a project that is underway. This is a project where we were approached by NEVCO, who had a US EPA community-wide assessment grant. NEVCO was approached by, I think, Ohio Erie Canalway, and the focus was on a site called Summit Lake in Akron. So if you go to the next slide, Summit Lake was, I think it's about an 80-acre lake. I think the land surrounding totals about 97 acres that we were looking at. But it's actually got a fairly interesting history. It was the city's drinking water source for a long period. It was the location of some fairly prominent amusement parks back in the 20s and 30s. If you go to the next slide, it now is in a fairly impoverished area of Akron. It's still used by recreational fishermen. It's not used by, it's not used for swimming, at least not, it's not supposed to be. and there's not much going on there until recently. There really wasn't much going on around it, and that's part of the focus of the Knight Foundation and Ohio Erie Canalway is they wanted to revitalize the canal between Summit Lake and downtown, and revitalize Summit Lake at the same time. So we were brought in to conduct phase 1, phase 2 studies on the dry land, and some ecological sediment analysis. Go to the next slide. So a lot of players involved with this one. There's the Trust for Public Land, the Knight Foundation, NEFCO, Ohio EPA, US EPA, City of Akron. A lot of people bringing funding together. Knight Foundation is going to be the primary funding source for the redevelopment itself. If you can go to the next slide. And the hope is that we would increase accessibility to the lake. They'd like to get some, they'd like to have beaches. We don't know if that's going to be feasible yet, but certainly docks, kayak launches, potentially swimming areas without beaches, and just an increased access for fishermen, because it is quite, it's actually a pretty productive lake. And our data ultimately showed that the water quality, now the water quality fluctuates in Summit Lake because it is used to both, it's pumped from, or drained, I should say, through the canalway to feed the river because of agreements that were made with the city. So the level fluctuates, there's a lot of flow through, but the water quality is essentially suitable for swimming. The shallow sediment was found to not pose an unacceptable risk. And so right now they're planning planning projects in place for creating access to the lakes and recreation around the lakes, and potentially making them more available for recreation for the surrounding neighborhoods. This next project is one that Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, because they had a requirement for creating green retention basins for their stormwater control. So this was part of one of their green infrastructure projects, and turns out it was a good portion of the property was quite contaminated. And if you would go to the next slide, this shows there was previously a residential area in general, but part of Kingsbury Run, one of the branches of Kingsbury Run ran through this property, and so there was an associated ravine. Next slide. And then over the years, that ravine was filled. And as it turned out, it was filled with construction debris, refuse, industrial waste, and then it became a junkyard, which didn't help. You go to the next slide. You can see some of what that junkyard operation looked like. This is what, one of those pictures is what was left of the bottom of the ravine after almost all of it was filled. It was just basically a cesspool. And we, through funding from the sewer district, conducted several assessments of the property. The sewer district went after US EPA money for cleanup, and they were able to get 2 $300,000 cleanup grants for the property, and that played a significant role in them going forward. Although they would have done the project anyway, it did meet the brownfield definition, and they certainly had a need for the money. So we did several cleanups of hotspots PCBs and PAHs. Go to the next slide. This is what it looks like. This was the plan, and then the following slide doesn't have it. Okay, never mind. This go back. So this is what it is today. It is essentially a park setting. There are trails. There's a restored wetland, and everything else is basically basin and green space. But it's a significant improvement for the neighborhood compared to what it was, and it does serve the purpose for the sewer district as well. Henninger Road landfill is one where Western Reserve Land Conservancy had an interest in connecting the trail from the zoo to the west of them to the existing trail to the east, and Henninger Road landfill was the only thing in the way. And so the Western Reserve Land Conservancy approached Cuyahoga County, who funded, with their US EPA community-wide money, funded an assessment of the property, and then Cuyahoga County was able to fund the VAP process, going through the VAP process using the revolving loan fund. And so what that site basically was, it was a landfill from 1948 to about 1987. A good portion of that time, it was an undocumented, unregulated landfill. And then they were permitted to take foundry sand and construction and demolition debris. And so no one was interested in taking ownership and helping to facilitate this path going through. So West Reserve Land Conservancy, they secured the Clean Ohio Conservation Fund grant for acquisition. Cuyahoga County used their US EPA money to pay for a consolidation of prior data and a risk assessment. And then like I said, they used the revolving loan fund, which was a US EPA funded at the Cuyahoga County, to conduct the additional assessments needed to get to the NFA. And now, this is probably hard to see, but you can see the trail system there where the landfill is and its relationship to the zoo. So it's really, and the Land Conservancy has since partnered with Metro Parks, who have started the construction process on the trail system. So it's a pretty neat success story there on a kind of a, green reuse of the brownfield. This is not the trail that's there again, but it is the trail that is going to connect to in this next slide. All right, so this next one is, next slide, I'm sorry. So this is a site where NEFCO, with their community-wide assessment grant, we conducted phase 1 and phase 2 assessments, and the land bank ultimately came in to acquire and consolidate the adjoining parcels, and that facilitated a new Dollar Tree in this neighborhood, which was a significant improvement to what it was before. I'm going to turn it back to John to talk about a couple of other uses that are not so assessment oriented, more planning oriented. And again, these are grants that land banks can get. I know a lot of these examples, the land bank wasn't as involved, but it's all funds that the land banks are eligible for. Before I move on, there are a couple slides that we didn't get in here, and we've had some good examples of projects with Lake County Land Bank. They've actually stepped in, and because of their protections under Ohio law, were able to acquire a salt fill landfill that was under orders from Ohio EPA. And then they went through and followed the due diligence and bona fide prospectus purchaser process and acquired or took ownership of that landfill, so it would be out of the hands of the responsible party. And the Ohio EPA is currently, with the settlement money, is currently putting out bids to have that salt fill removed. And ultimately the land bank will then turn the land bank over to whoever the chosen end user is, whether it's the Natural History Museum or Lake Metro Parks or who it may be. But they played an important role in getting it out of the hands of the responsible party so that the cleanup could be done. And we've done a lot of work with Summit Land Bank, and they're taking ownership of blighted properties so that there would at least be a steward of the property, to them playing a key role in getting some orders and OEPA orders and MERCA closure requirements resolved at a property in the city of Macedonia where there was a potential end user. And I know we've accompanied potential buyers to tour the site. So again, both those folks are very active in this kind of work as well. John?
Okay. All right, I think we can probably post the second question for everyone. Oh, not that one.
What is it?
What corridors are subject to a brownfield inventory? Was there another question that we had on there that we could use? Or we can post both of them at the end. Okay, there it was. We can go to the next slide. All right, so as John mentioned, I'm going to review two projects that involved brownfield inventories. They're more planning in nature, and then a project that involves a landfill that's located in the city of Cleveland. All three projects would not have been possible without the Cuyahoga County Land Reutilization Corporation working with the other entities that vary, which is going to be which I thought was interesting, in using the US EPA grant that Cuyahoga County Land Bank acquired. And they were able to use money under a petroleum and a hazardous materials property that's used petroleum and or hazardous materials. So brownfield inventories identified parcels for further assessment based on the US EPA definition of a brownfield. We discussed that earlier. I have reiterated the definition here. The purpose of the brownfield inventory was to examine large areas, linear areas, and to gain enough information that would allow some decision making on what parcels, based on a redevelopment plan or existing land use plan, would be the best targets for additional assessment. Next slide, please. So our scope of work included a database review, which is standard for doing environmental investigations, such as a phase 1 environmental site assessment. We examined city directories, Sanborn fire insurance maps. Anyone not familiar with those is Sanborn fire insurance maps are maps of neighborhoods that actually identify fire, threats to fires, things that would make a fire difficult to fight: underground storage tanks, dip tanks, solvent and degreasing areas, and they name a lot of historical locations on parcels that you're investigating. We examined aerial photographs and then also took a look at public information such as the current owner, address, the land use, such as the zoning, and the parcel size and acreage. What we typically look at in these in areas when you're doing brownfield inventories are conditions typically that pose an environmental concern, which are auto repair facilities, gasoline filling stations, underground storage tanks. I reference gasoline, but there's also waste oil, hazardous materials formerly used by industrial operations, dry cleaners, which use chlorinated solvents to clean clothes, and various commercial industrial facilities and their processes, such as painting and plating. Next slide, please. So our first location is in East Cleveland, Ohio. The land bank worked with City of East Cleveland, the municipality directly. We examined Euclid Avenue and one of the offshot main thoroughfares, Hayden Avenue. This portion of Euclid Avenue is located between the City of Cleveland and then moving towards the west, the City of Euclid. Next slide, please. We examined 380 parcels were identified along the Euclid Avenue corridor. Of the 380, we identified 104 brownfields. On the Hayden Avenue corridor, there was 187 parcels with 62 brownfields. Of the 166 brownfield properties, 56 were vacant. What we did at that point was examine which parcels were publicly owned and privately owned. 35 were privately owned and recommended for phase ones, or publicly owned, and 21 were privately owned. Our purpose for splitting out public versus private was access to a publicly owned parcel, whether it was owned by the land bank or the East Cleveland or the City of Cleveland, allowed for access issues to be minimal to none. Although we had 21 parcels that were privately owned, the City of East Cleveland partners and Cuyahoga County got together and the land bank, I'm sorry, yeah, the Cuyahoga County Land Bank, identified 10 properties to be to have phase one environmental site assessments completed on them. Next. Similarly, we did a project. Well, let's go back one slide. So where this comes into from a planning component, going through the corridor, identifying the properties for phase ones and completing the phase ones sets us up for the next round of funding. And if we would go back to, we don't have to, but when we discuss the public funding resources, that's where we can go back and for resources that require phase ones, you can go back to that table and identify who you would approach for the next round of of assessment in the form of an asbestos survey, phase two site assessment, geophysical surveys, and so on. So that wasn't included in this slide, but that's where we're setting the table for the next step. Go ahead, next slide, please. This time, the Cuyahoga County Land Bank worked with a nonprofit, Midtown Cleveland, working on Carnegie and Payne Avenues, which are primary thoroughfares through the Midtown service area. Next slide. 256 parcels were identified along Carnegie Avenue. 108 of them were brownfields. Of the 167 parcels on Payne, 63 were brownfields. Of the 166 Brownfield properties, only 30 were vacant. Similarly, we split them up into public and privately owned properties, conferred with Midtown Cleveland, which actually has a redevelopment plan that we could overlay our brownfield properties onto, to then select and identify those parcels that are most important to Midtown's plan. As a result, we are in the process of completing 10 phase ones. Well, six of 10 phase ones. We are still waiting to gain access to some privately owned parcels. Next slide. All right, this is the Schaaf Road Landfill project. This was a team was the Cuyahoga County Land Bank working with West Creek Conservancy and Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer. The purpose of this work was to determine how we could reuse the top of the landfill, the flat surface, and at the same time conduct a stream restoration and bank stabilization for West Creek, which runs along the toe of the landfill and was rerouted back as part of the landfill development. Next slide, please. This is just a quick overview of the information that we brought together. Because there was not a lot of publicly available information, we had to use various sources to recreate what the landfill has as far as monitoring wells, explosive gas, geotechnical borings, and the limits of waste. Next slide. Our work, we reviewed 236 documents. I give the breakout. I'm kind of running through this in a hurry because we're running out of time, but this is the breakout of all the documents that we reviewed. Next slide. Our final conclusions included doing an ALTA survey to determine the developable part of the property, conduct planning activities such as land use assessment, infrastructure inventory, market studies, and a reuse assessment. In addition, we recommended doing a wetlands determination and delineation. Next slide. Oh, and then depending on what their plan would be, they may have to do a NEPA investigation and upgrade their sedimentation pond. And the first step would be to contact and coordinate with the Ohio EPA. Next slide. Oh, so I was just bringing that back around if we had time to ask questions about it. But that completes our presentation.
John, both to
Yes.
John Zampino, and
Yes.
I'm always amazed at the width and the breadth of the work that you guys do. And I really appreciate it. I know your contact information is on there. We have access to the deck. I've had a person text me, is it possible we can see these slides? Can we post them publicly, or would you rather work with us individually? Do you have any decision on that?
I think we could probably post them to our website.
Your website, okay. We'll let people know, because I've had a couple of people text me and ask me if they have access to this. So we really appreciate it. It was very, very informative. And as I said, I'm amazed at the quality and the quantity. You guys are in projects everywhere. We want to thank you. And I want to let the people in the Land Bank Network know we're going to take about a 30-minute break. We'll be back at 12:50.